Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'd just like to start with saying that it's been kind of a joy following all the presentations today. It's been a lot of work that's kind of closely linked to what I'm going to present now. And there's a lot of work that I'd like to pursue and kind of connect with my own work. So this is kind of a great opportunity. And I think that's kind of the idea with the conference. And as such, it seems to be off to a great start, I think. My name is Henrik Skaug Sætra. I'm an associate professor at Østfold University College in Norway. And I'm also working at KPMG in Norway in a division called Pure Sustainability. So while my talk is called a framework for evaluating AI sustainability, the subtitle or kind of sort of the main title, it has now become kind of ESG and the SDGs. And I'll get back to kind of what the ESG is for those that are not that familiar with it. Because in our work, we're seeing that a lot of people and a lot of work is being done in the ESG and sustainable finance and the EU Green Deal and that area these days. But it's not really connected to the issues we're talking about in the research community when it comes to AI ethics and sustainability of AI, for example. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. How can we kind of bridge that gap? So the points that I'll turn to is the sustainability and the sustainable development goals, which I have chosen to use in my project. And I'd just like to note that this is kind of very much a work in progress that I'm kind of developing in these days. So it's not kind of a ready-made framework that is kind of findable out there, but it's getting there, and it's based on one previous publication earlier this year and another working paper that I'm kind of hoping to publish in relation to this kind of work. I'll then turn to the analytical approach to AI impacts, because this is where I kind of diverge from a lot of the people that say we need more data, we need proof, we need empirical kind of evidence that something is or is not sustainable, because I think we need something else as well. We need both a different approach and a kind of purely scientific or empirical approach. And then I'll get to kind of the starting of the framework for analyzing and disclosing AI impact with a particular focus on ESG related kind of frameworks. So it's a kind of a very practical framework that I'm kind of arriving at towards the end there. The main goal then is kind of to see we have AI and we have kind of sustainability, these two great concepts that are being talked about more than most other concepts perhaps these days in society, right? So what's the linkage between these two? How are they related? And you have Winsberg saying that kind of you have AI for sustainability and you have the sustainability of AI. Those are clearly relevant aspects that we need to take into account. And I think a lot of the frameworks already do, but they don't necessarily kind of analytically state that they do. So I think, yeah, we'll get back to that, how they are connected. But a more kind of novel approach then is perhaps how we kind of bridge the gap between what's happening in AI ethics and what's been happening in AI ethics for quite a long time, and what's happening in the world of ESG, which is kind of the world of environmental, social, and governance-related issues. And that is kind of a term that's taken over for corporate social responsibility, at least in my domain, or at least in my work of consulting, for example, especially in finance. ESG is kind of the term people are using these days, and these are the kinds of concepts they use in terms of talking about sustainability. So you have ESG reporting and disclosure, which is kind of synonymous for a lot of businesses for talking about the sustainability of their businesses. So that's why I think it's important kind of to bridge that gap between what we know and what we see are the main challenges in AI ethics and what's happening in the world of ESG. So first of all, we can just state that kind of what is sustainability in order to just make clear that we're talking about the same thing. Because a lot of people have been using this definition already, I think, because I use the definition of sustainable development. The 1987 definition from the Brundtland Commission, Our Common Future, is kind of based on the idea that we are talking about a sort of development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That is kind of the basic framework. And there are three dimensions here, which is the environment, the society, and the economy. And I think the economical aspects are pretty much well understood in certain terms, but not all the terms. So I think AI ethics has a lot to contribute there too, but not as much perhaps as in the social dimension, which is kind of more my focus than on the environmental dimension as well. So that makes it kind of complementary to a lot of the discussions that's been previous today, in which a lot of attention is paid to kind of the climate emissions of using machine learning algorithms, for example. So that's kind of obviously a very important aspect. But there are societal aspects that are kind of even more important to translate from AI ethics into ESG, in my opinion. So this is kind of the nested model as well, because I kind of assume that AI systems, and I'll get back to kind of what I mean by that, affects the economy, which in turn affects the social aspect, which in turn affects the environmental aspect. And AI can directly influence all of these. The Sustainable Development Goals, also very well known. And the reason I'm using them is not really because they have fancy colors and they're so easy to understand, but it's because a lot of people are using them these days. Almost all sustainability reports you'll see have this kind of logos placed under the different chapters, for example, in their kind of sustainability disclosures, without really engaging with them at all, usually. Well, some do, but very many actually just put these kind of stickers on there because they have these kind of good colors, and politicians and the civil society and businesses have kind of agreed that this is what we're working for now, without really taking it seriously. It's kind of my argument. So I'm trying to build a framework where we can use these Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for trying to kind of eke out what are the sustainability related impacts of the AI systems we use. And the people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships is kind of the 5 Ps of the Agenda 2030. So that's the basics here. ESG is environment, social, and governance. And that's kind of where I kind of diverge a little bit from the basic, just relating to the 3 dimensions of sustainability, for example, or just using the Sustainable Development Goals as a general framework, because I'm trying to connect this to the world of business pretty much, and reporting and disclosure. Not really because I think that's the most important aspect, but because I think there's an important job to be done in terms of translating what we know and research into their domain so that they can actually use this. And if you look at the social development or the Sustainable Development Goals, they have also been translated into this kind of environment, social, and governance framework as well. You'll see from this figure from Berenberg that it's kind of certain goals are placed in several categories. For example, clean water and sanitation is both under environment and social, for example. And Sustainable Development Goal 16 is both under social and governance. And that kind of makes a bit of sense as well, I think. So that's the framework I'm using here. And on the working paper that I'm basing this on, my kind of critical approach to how sustainability reporting is done has been kind of based on an examination of how Microsoft, as a case example, has been using the SDGs and what they call CSR still as their kind of basis for reporting and disclosing the impacts of their AI systems. So I will be returning to a couple of examples, but I haven't really incorporated that much in this report. But they are kind of an example of how it should not be done in my case, for example, or in my opinion, because they're pretty much saying that they released their separate report, even saying that kind of we are focusing on the sustainable development goals. We are assisting them, enabling them, and we focus, for example, on education. And this is kind of the story of how we are positively contributing to quality education, and it kind of stops there, without kind of saying or evaluating any of the negative impacts or even the potential negative impacts related to different goals, how the goals are interconnected, or how AI systems could directly kind of harm the achievement of reaching a good quality education goal. So that's kind of what I've been kind of doing, trying to analyze actual sustainability disclosure and reporting. The analytical approach, calling it, is based on a definition of AI systems which is very broad, which we're saying any software technology with at least one of the following capabilities, because I'm kind of borrowing this from WinOASA now. et al. And that's the paper that was presented earlier today as well, which we'll return to shortly. Just in order to kind of have, this is a definition that's being used when sustainability and SDGs are being connected to AI. And it's a very broad definition that lets us talk about all, or at least pretty much all AI relevant systems in which AI is being developed, AI is being used in some particular way in terms of perception, decision-making, prediction, automatic knowledge extraction, and pattern recognition, interactive communication, logical reasoning, which kind of includes a lot of different AI systems. The impacts are categorized and approached through the SDGs. And when we see that kind of, is AI an enabler or an inhibitor of the SDGs? And this is the figure that was presented earlier today, right? We saw that earlier today as well. It's the Vinuesa article from 2020, in which they kind of examined the role of artificial intelligence in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Because Blair was kind of saying it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. If this is kind of an accurate portrayal of what AI will do to our societies and the Sustainable Development Goals, we are clearly headed for the better times. As you see to the left side here, the kind of the inner circles, or the kind of figure that's kind of jittered within there, it's much larger than the figure on the right side. That means AI enables a lot of the SDGs far more than it harms the SDGs. So you see on the right side, that are kind of the negative impacts of AI, and the left side is the positive impacts, which might lead us to think that AI is pretty much for sustainability. It's kind of mostly an enabler of the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think it's not that simple, and we have to go a little bit further. So my main points in the articles I've written is kind of that an isolated and atomistic approach is insufficient. And we often see that kind of AI is used effectively in an HR system, for example, in an experiment or in some article or in a case study or in a use case. Someone has described AI as being efficient in reaching some of the sub-goals or an indicator related to an SDG. If so, people check the box and say, yes, this enables SDG 8. Right? In technically, it is correct, but it's not sufficient. It's kind of my argument. An evidence-based and a quantitative approach is also insufficient, saying that we only count or we only kind of evaluate the impacts that are proven empirically makes us overlook a lot of different potential risks. If there's no evidence of increased inequality or shifts of power available, for example, AI is not an inhibitor. That could lead us to saying that kind of if there is no evidence, empirical evidence, we will discount it and say that it is not detrimental to the SDGs. And I think that's kind of also a bit too exclusive in terms of kind of not evaluating all the risks. So multiple effects for most AI systems, both positive and negatives, and there is an interdependence between the effects. And there's an interdependence between the SDGs, as others have noted today as well, because kind of combating climate change will kind of will lead to sacrifices in terms of life on land, for example, and life in the water, in terms of energy sources and those kinds of things. Two key concepts and approaches. We have direct effects versus indirect effects. AI can directly contribute to, for example, innovation in a particular sector. That is important. We can get better infrastructure, or we can get better kind of technologies in order to solve general problems better. If we don't separate between direct and indirect effects, you'll count these effects multiple times. You'll count a positive contribution on all the Sustainable Development Goals equally. And I think we kind of need to kind of separate where you kind of positively influence one goal that has key or crucial interdependencies with other ones that should be kind of commented on. In addition, we'll have the micro, meso, and the macro level effects. And the micro and macro level has already been discussed previously today in a very good presentation I really liked. But the meso level is important as well, I think. So those are the things that I think we need to get in here. And in the previous paper I published, I emphasized that the SDGs, while they say innovation is good, economic growth is good, they also stated in a language that says promote access to and fair and equitable sharing of benefits, for example. Those kinds of languages or those kinds of sentences are deeply embedded in the Agenda 2030. Sustainable Development Goals. Support economic development and human well-being with a focus on affordable and equitable access for all. And this kind of reading these things and taking them seriously has key consequences for how we evaluate the use of AI, database systems or algorithms based on kind of huge data sets that most do not have either the resources, computing power, or access to data in order to develop. Because the Sustainable Development Goals also says that development should be local and accessible to local communities, for example. So what I'm saying in this article is that AI can have a positive effect on a meso level, for example, on a particular company or a region, while that effect will in turn lead to greater inequality, for example, and it might also lead to harms on the micro level, individual level. I won't really have time to go into that here, but that's the kind of published article, so anyone can read that if they want to. It's called AI in Context and Sustainable Development Goals. So that takes me, in this very rushed presentation, I'm sorry, to what I call analyzing and disclosing AI impacts, because this is where we get into the kind of sort of fun stuff that not everybody has been talking about so far. Someone has mentioned the GRI, right? So that's the one term we have seen already, one framework for disclosing and reporting ESG-related issues. But you also have the GRESB, the SASB, the TSFD, CDP, World Economic Forum, stakeholder metrics. You have a plethora of different frameworks and standards, but none, is my argument, sufficiently capture key concerns highlighted in AI ethics. So that's what I think we need to do. In the World Economic Forum framework, for example, you see that kind of dealing with dignity and equality is about stating numbers, diversity and inclusion, percentage of employees, pay equality, wage level, risk for incidents for child. Those are the kind of quantitative measures that doesn't really allow us to go deep into the problems the way we need to do. So I think we need a qualitative analysis and disclosure. And this is a supplement to other ESG reporting frameworks. It's not a replacement of them. In the process, and what I'm kind of proposing and working on is using the regular process of a situation and materiality analysis, SDG-based, with an evaluation protocol in which you kind of take from research the types of impacts, levels, and ripple effects, and kind of make this kind of questionnaire or this form that the companies can use in order to evaluate how they impact sustainability issues. And incorporate this in the chosen sustainability reporting framework. So you can use the GRI or the SASB if you want to with this kind of process. This is just to kind of eke out the consequences. So the first step then would say, how do you deal with the impacts? Are all impacts evaluated equally? Do you say that if you have an environmental negative impact and a positive social impact, as in the talks before me, how do we kind of balance this? And I said that you need to do a materiality analysis in order to kind of evaluate and rank the different goals and purposes. And this is usually done by having on one axis the importance to stakeholders and on the other importance to the company. So on the vertical axis, you have how important is this for stakeholders? And this would be according to the company. So this is in context, right? And importance to the company is how much can the company affect this issue? It might be heavily involved in kind of training models, for example, in which climate effects will be highly material for them. And by doing this, you get kind of the lower upper right quadrant that are the kind of the key issues that you need to go into depth on. Those are the most material issues. Now I'll skip this one. The SASB has kind of made a guide for us that you can use in order to do this process. But this is where I'm going to end up when I'm kind of done with this work, in which you get this kind of framework in which you can say that if SDG 8, for example, has proven to be material for you, you will be required to kind of, or not required to, but you'll be provided with a kind of list of questions that say that kind of on a micro level, for example. Does the company use AI systems in ways that possibly impacts workers, for example, positively impacts workers on the left side? Those are the positive impacts on the micro, meso, and macro level. On the right side are the negative impacts. So you get both, right? You can say we do good and we do bad, and we do it on these different levels. Our systems has consequences on the macro level that are negative, on the positive, on the micro and meso level, for example. On the right and the left side, you have the kind of ripples too. So by influencing economic growth, we positively affect no poverty goals, for example. And on the lower side, this goal is being affected by other goals as well. But this is very rushed, and I hope to kind of get this out in the paper. But my main conclusion would be, I'm sorry if it hasn't been able to kind of follow all of this, but the purpose of this in the conclusion is that AI ethics and sustainability is closely linked. And I think that AI ethics is broader than the SDGs and ST in general, sustainable development, and that we also need to have human rights frameworks and other frameworks that take privacy issues and a lot of the issues not covered in the SDGs into effect as well. So from the previous article, I said that SDGs do not sufficiently cover harms that befalls individuals through, for example, a lack of privacy and those kinds of issues. So it must be complemented with other frameworks. In general, this simple process presents and fosters understanding of AI impacts. It's usable by non-experts of AI ethics in general, and that's kind of the main purpose that I think we need to get this in there. And it's usable by businesses in the reporting and disclosure process. So that's time up, and I'm almost at the end, so I think that'll do. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, many thanks to you. This was a really inspiring talk, and thanks for carefully examining the SDGs close or like in relation to the conference topic. That was really insightful for me, and I guess it was for the other people as well. We will now start with the Q&A. As always, everyone can feel free to ask the questions. Just use the chat function. I will just start with the first question in our chat, which is, you mentioned the need to focus on risks or aspects that are qualitative as opposed to quantitative. Can you say something more about the kinds of qualitative aspects you're thinking of?
Yeah, I think I'm mainly concerned with that we have to allow for the use of speculative and philosophical examination of risks and potential risks and long-term harms. Because I think a lot of the risks that we're talking about and a lot of the crucial issues of AI ethics is not something that you can empirically demonstrate with a kind of certainty at any point in time. And if we kind of exclude all speculative evidence, as Vinuesa call it, they say that we disregard all speculative evidence. And that means they end up with a kind of very positive view of AI, right? By excluding all of these kinds of qualitative and philosophical, if you will, and non-empirical investigations of risks, for example, of increased power shifts in power over time, for example, by big tech using large data sets, those kinds of things, the inequalities and discriminatory nature of AI systems, for example. So I'm not at all saying that empirical evidence is not important. I say that this is complementary, and I just said that we also need to be kind of open for allowing, if you will, the speculative evidence that a lot of kind of researchers will find a lot of opposition to when they kind of do this kind of, how will this affect human relationships in the future, for example, those kinds of AI ethics questions, they aren't easily answerable through empirical methods right now. So I think we have to kind of allow for there to be a risk of long-term negative impact that must be kind of taken into account at least. And that's kind of the very basis of ESG framework in general, kind of risk management. And they take all sorts of risks in terms of climate risk, transition risks, all these kinds of things. These are non-certain risks, right? And companies still say that, yes, there is a chance that this will happen. So we need to account for what to do if it happens, and we need to kind of minimize the chances of it happening. So mine is kind of just a call for speculative science in addition to kind of the empirical science, I think.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of risk, this might be a follow-up question. You put emphasis on the indirect and unintended side effects of AI. Would you like to explore this more, or like give us an insight what these indirect effects are and why they are so important?
And the indirect effects, sure. Some of it could be kind of trying to achieve SDG 9, for example, which is 3 goals in one pretty much. You have to break them up, but one of them is innovation. And by kind of fostering innovation and trying to reach this, you will at times, you will impact all other different SDGs, I think. And there is no way of knowing exactly how, is my kind of argument. Because by building different systems for kind of AR systems, for example, or kind of general algorithms that can be used for a lot of different applications, including recruitment processes, for example, you will, by doing a lot of innovation and IT development or software development, you will be affecting different kinds of systems in ways that aren't easily kind of identified. So that's, yeah, perhaps one. And the indirect unintended effects are always there. So kind of, I don't think anyone intends to be evil when they're going to build AI systems and kind of deploy them into the world. Not even kind of human resources recruiters. I don't think they intend to be evil when they make an algorithm that will kind of make recruitment process more effective. But there are both positive and negative effects. And I think by kind of carefully examining these and being open to kind of where does this ripple to, and always asking this question instead of kind of just checking the box, yes, this helps economic growth, and just saying, yeah, that's done, and then we can do something else, some other system. But just always asking is kind of where does this ripple to? What are the kind of next level effects? And I just think that's important. And I'm sorry, I don't have any great examples other than some of these now.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for this insight. I'll jump to the next question, which is, could you maybe explain more how you mean to complement the SDGs with other frameworks? Aren't the human rights, for instance, a prerequisite for the SDGs?
Yes, but I think the SDGs are incomplete as well. So I like the SDGs and I want to use the SDGs, but I think they are severely incomplete in terms of addressing the kind of micro level or individual level effects that I've been writing about in terms of kind of how does AI systems and big data applications limit my freedom, personal freedom, individual freedom, for example. Manipulative practices, kind of how are those addressed in the SDGs? I think not sufficiently. And I think that's kind of where a EU regulation with the proposed EU regulation goes much farther in terms of helping us understand kind of the negative impacts of AI, for example, in terms of manipulative or behavior shaping use in education, for example. I don't think these issues are sufficiently covered by the SDGs. So that's why I think the human rights are more concerned with fundamental individual rights. The SDGs are much more on a meso and a macro level, as a kind of my opinion on them. So I think a lot of the kind of privacy-related, surveillance-related effects of AI is not sufficiently captured by the SDGs. So I think we need some kind of additional checklist. So that's kind of my main point. Others might severely disagree and think that the SDGs are complete.
Hopefully, I guess that is what research is about.
Yeah.
So I will go to one of the last questions for today, which is, do you think we have to adapt the SDGs to the digital age? Because maybe it is important that certain aspects which are becoming increasingly important, like digital rights, digital sovereignty, area addresses when it comes to the question what a desirable society might look like.
Yes, and that goes very well with the previous question, right? Because that's what I think should have been in there all along in terms of kind of worker rights and decent work. What is that, for example? What is this kind of SDG 16 with the peace and prosperity, those things? It's possible, it would have been possible to incorporate more sub-goals related to the individual level. But I think the purpose of the Sustainable Development Goals has been a bit different than simply kind of protecting individual rights. So I think, yeah, I think most of the concerns I'm thinking about doesn't necessarily have to become a part of the SDGs in order for us to achieve sustainable development. But I think I would prefer if they were, because I personally find these individual harms to be important enough to potentially derail kind of our road to sustainable development. But I don't think all agree. And I think this, our individual culture, our very individualist culture in which I am a very separate being from my community, for example, I think that kind of focus on the individual is not shared by everyone. And I think that's legitimate as well. And I think that might be one argument in favor of kind of not implementing all these kind of individual focused rights directly in the SDGs in order to get kind of this broad global consensus. But that's kind of just very speculative again, as I like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And sorry for not noticing the typo. That was my fault for reading it out loud. I have one last question for you, because before we stop this last Q&A for this day, and that is, some companies are now exploring the introduction of AI ethics into their development processes, and they do this with the help of consulting companies, for example, Deloitte, etc. Do you think companies will feel an overload if they must do an ethics assessment and a sustainability assessment, or do you think the two should be merged?
I think it needn't be merged, but it might beneficially be merged. But I think these are kind of very complementary, these two processes. So I also think that the kind of the sustainability process, which will be easier and kind of less demanding on a company that has run through a kind of pre-process in the development phase, because they already know that a lot of the governance issues in the ESG, right, is related to kind of the diversity and the kind of process and the stakeholder involvement and all these kinds of responsible research and innovation and value sensitive design. All those things are, according, or at least to me, should be incorporated in the G in the ESG. And if these things are present in the development phase, I think that kind of just, eases or makes the end process easier. But I think it should be a part of the sustainability process, and the ESG process is there anyway. And anyone that's trying to find money in the market now are kind of have to go through the ESG process anyway. So I think they need both. Okay, thank you so much. That was the last question of today. Thanks for giving your talk. I've learned a lot. I'm sure the other participants did too. Now it's time to wrap up this first conference day. First of all, again, many thanks to every speaker and panelist today, to everyone who joined us via live stream. This was an exciting and inspiring first conference day, and we are incredibly grateful for all of your contributions and for every single person who has joined us today. So thank you very much. We can't wait for tomorrow and for Thursday. Before we part ways for today, I have a few more announcements. So tomorrow we will begin at 10 o'clock, and please use the same link as today. This goes for speakers and for participants as well. And of course, tomorrow we have another exciting agenda for you. We start with an introduction and we'll host 2 more paper sessions during the day. So in the first paper session, we will have 2 talks outlining the current development in mapping. And after the lunch break, the next paper session takes place and explores pressing issues in the overall context of sustainable AI. So we'll hear outstanding talks linked to topics such as human rights, weapon systems, or biobanks. So stay tuned for that. And of course, we have another highlight for you, because we will finish the day with a fireside chat with Professor Mark Köckelberg and Professor Amy van Weinsberg. In this context, Mark Köckelberg will introduce his new book, dealing with the issue of AI and climate change. It hasn't been published yet, and we have the privilege of being the first ones interviewing Mark Köckelberg about this new publication. So the book discusses the problem of freedom and the limits of liberalism, considering challenges of governing climate change and artificial intelligence. To have some more information, the title will be Green Leviathan, or the Poetics of Political Liberty, Navigating Freedom in the Age of Climate Change and Artificial Intelligence. Mark Köckelberg will dedicates his book to questions like, can AI save the planet, or does this mean we have to give up our political freedom? So this is beyond exciting, and you're more than welcome to join.
And I have one last reminder before we say goodbye. And these are really exciting news, as you can probably see right next to me. In collaboration with the journal Sustainability, we are currently calling for papers. So our special issue, which is called Towards the Sustainability of AI, Multidisciplinary Approaches to Investigate the Hidden Costs of AI, is open for papers, and you can submit your paper until September 1st. This addresses both speakers. Do you want to say something, Amy? I'm sorry. Okay, I thought you were waving at me. This addresses both speakers and participants, so go check this out if you're interested in submitting a paper about sustainable AI. We are now looking forward to your submissions, and I think maybe Professor van Weinsberg would like to have the last words of today. For now, okay, she doesn't, I'm sorry. For now, we just wish you a great evening, and we can't wait to see you tomorrow and to see you on Thursday. Yeah, we see each other virtually.